Welcome to the Hedgineer Podcast with your hosts, Michael Watson and Jhanvi Virani.
And welcome back to another episode of the Hedgineer Podcast Season 3. I'm your co-host, Michael Watson.
And I'm your other co-host, Jhanvi Virani. And today on the pod, we have our good friend, Mitch. Mitch, do you want to start by just giving a quick introduction of yourself for the audience?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Mitch. I am one of the two co-founders of Basis. We are a agent platform for accountants. We're based here entirely in New York City. We're about 100 people. And I like to talk about and think a lot about what the future of kind of agent systems at scale for real production use cases looks like.
Well, you're right on the right podcast. I'll tell you that.
Cool.
And this is a really special episode for me personally, because you're not just a random person in my network. You're a very good friend of mine. And we started off not only working at the same company out of college, but on the same team at the same company, just 2 desks apart. And I remember as we grew close very, very quickly. And I think part of the reason why I think we became friends was because we both enjoyed talking about ideas, like big ideas. And so it's really interesting and fun and almost a little surreal to be on this podcast talking about these companies that we're building years later. And so I don't know, this is just a very...
We'll just send the episode to the marquee team.
Yeah, we'll send it to everyone that we used to work with. And they have to watch it.
Yeah.
I also remember meeting your now co-founder, Matt, but at that point, he was actually your roommate when we were working together. And I remember distinctly, you used to throw a lot of house parties at that really nice house and apartment that you had. And I met him there. And I remember it was like one of the first conversations that I had with someone in a really long time, like a complete stranger at a party. And we were talking about AI of all things. And he was talking, this was like 2021, 2022. And it was one of his roommates. And we got into this like 30 to 40 minute conversation about how eventually agents are going to do like 85% of all work, like within companies. And it was like at that point, a very crazy and weird idea. And we were talking about it. And I remember going back home to my roommate at the time. And I was like, oh, I had this very weird and strange conversation with one of Mitch's roommates. And we were talking about AI in this very strange way. But I think that we were right about all of it. And like now we're here. So very interesting kind of full circle moment. And what's really interesting about Basis, similar to Hedgineer, is that there's a ton of AI companies today. But Basis started off years ago kind of on the cutting edge of really defining what AI could do for enterprise organizations, specifically within accounting. And so one of the first questions I have for you are, as someone that's been thinking about AI for longer than I think 95% of people, what are you thinking about in terms of AI now that you weren't thinking about 6 months ago or a year ago? Like what's top of mind for you that's new?
Well, I think that as model capabilities improve, the ability for, first it's models to regulate their state to have agency, to become agents, then it's agents' ability to regulate their own state, to operate for longer periods of time. And as you get more and more intelligent, you get better at regulating your own state, it opens up huge possibilities from a product perspective, UX perspective, intelligence perspective of what is actually possible, both on the product side and on the applied ML side. So one of my favorite topics to think about and work on is actually closing like the loop. And I do think we are not too far from closing the applied ML loop in terms of having self-improving agents doing real production work where they can improve their own harness, improve their own context, optimize trajectories without needing a human to actually design the system. And that is only possible as you get agents that are able to, regulate their own state better coming from improved intelligence. So I think that is the kind of stuff that is really, really interesting. I think if you, even a year ago, extrapolate what happens as intelligence gets better, both at inference time and also just broadly from like model size, I think you can definitely get there, but you're probably not spending time thinking about it a year ago, right? So I think those are some of the things I like to think about.
Awesome. So in terms of closing the loop,
Yep.
you touch on improving context, improving the quality of state, creating your own tools kind of on the fly. What are your thoughts on reinforcement learning and having the model be able to fine tune its own weights on the fly as well? Is that something that you think about, or is it more like how do you allow the model to fine tune its own context?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think in terms of what's publicly known for other companies, I think the only real current example of continuously reinforcement training in production is Cursor's, composer models of their tab before. And so I think if you have a use case like the tab that's very kind of idiosyncratic and kind of makes sense, and something like Composer where you are, like the reason you are doing that is cost and latency. It's not really performance. I think if you think about like the three different elements, you have cost, latency, performance. I think if you're trying to optimize performance, continual reinforcement learning today probably does not yield much benefit. And the reason it probably doesn't yield much benefit is that the model's raw intelligence in terms of getting it to behave, to perform really, really well in whatever harness you have is far better served. Like the gains to inference time scaling and sort of general training from the model providers is still yielding sufficient gains to which training the model directly on your own environment is not actually that useful yet, because you can use intelligence to sort of brute force that. I do think it's possible that might change in the future, but I think at least today, I don't think from a quality perspective it is particularly important.
But from the performance one, there's incredible benefits of that. Like, for example, Composer just absolutely kills in terms of speed. Because when you say performance,
when it's performance, I mean quality.
In terms of the quality, yeah. I guess what I meant to say is in terms of the speed.
Agreed.
And then tokens per second.
Totally agreed.
Is absolutely wild, especially when you switch between a Composer, then you go back to Claude Code. Even if you're using Haiku, the speed that you get from Composer, then Composer 2, like absolutely like slays when it comes to like very quick iteration loops, very quick inference time. And it's the one reason why I don't think like once somebody's got really good workflows in Cursor, it's really hard to go back to a Claude Code where just that agentic loop is almost an order of magnitude slower.
Yeah, I think post-training in general clearly has incredible benefits at the applied layer for cost and latency purposes. And today, not really much for quality purposes would be my kind of sense.
I think if you have very well-defined quality requirements, like a very strict set of tools and a mitigated, like a very limited amount of heterogeneity in the types of like output options, a limited scope, that you don't necessarily need that much better performance.
I agree. Yeah.
And sometimes like the general performance is adding a bunch of features that you don't need. If you just need like, I need you to make a decision between these 10 different tools, these 50 different KPI line items. Other than that, that's all you need to do. The reinforcement learning can just potentially hone into those specific skills better, but it's a relatively limited use case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, well, I mean, in that case, like let's say you had 5.5 extra high, right? I find it unlikely that 5.5 extra high would perform worse than like a much smaller, cheaper model, even on the limited use case. Now, it might perform close to the same, to which it doesn't matter, and it's like way faster and way cheaper, and like that's great. But I think you're doing that for the latency and the cost. I think one big exception where I think you could get actually massive outperformance, not just like performance in line, is situations that are really out of sample from the pre-training set that require lots of kind of taste and subjectivity. So the example I think about a lot, at least for us, is for evals, like judges, right? Like if you're thinking about trying to judge output, that is, depending on what you're judging, potentially very subjective and might be very hard to properly articulate what good looks like in English. And so given you are essentially trying to train a model at runtime with, you're training it at inference time with, call it 200,000 tokens, maybe that 200,000 tokens is not as representative of what good looks like as if you were able to train it with like thousands of examples in a more post-training type situation because but you really believe in that training data. The thing is that's tough because that implies you have that set that you can actually do and you believe in it so thoroughly that you're willing to commit it to the weights. But in theory, I think that is a place where you could definitely see it if you were able to try to distill taste down, because examples at the end of the day, will get represented better in the weights than you can probably represent them in English.
Yeah. No, we don't do any reinforcement learning on our end, but one of the areas where we have incredible potential training data is from usage analytics of capturing everything a user does when they're interacting with an AI. And some of that includes inherent taste where the user says, no, I don't like it when you do that. Oh, that was really cool. Oh, or like, oh, actually, like whenever you generate a chart that looks like this, never add the y-axis in bold. And that has different ways in which it can be interpreted or manifest within like the way a model might interpret it. But if you can capture sometimes that taste just from usage analytics and then reinforce that into the weights for like a user specific model, I think that's another example of that. If you ever wanted like individual models tailored per person without having to include all of that, essentially right now you solve for that with memory and like individual context that's injected into the model at runtime for a specific user. But if you can just take that, train the model, make it available within the weights, it can be very, very powerful in that sense as well. But you basically put taste into the model weights in post-training.
Yeah, one of the things that I was just talking with one of our product managers about a couple of days ago was right now we're kind of enabling our clients to build their own skills. And so as a result, there's no real format on how we're evaluating them, because if a user is building their own skill, they're not going to take the time to build their own evaluation rubric. And so we were talking about the idea of using the usage data of when those skills are actually invoked and the outputs and the sentiment behind how the user responds. Either they say, no, this is wrong, fix X, Y, Z, or they just leave the session and everything kind of went smoothly. But can we use that data to then retroactively create rubrics and then fine tune them as people keep using the skills more and more frequently?
Well, I think there is. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I think there's actually two different things there. There is one thing, which is how do you extract like signal from production trajectories, and then how do you leverage that signal to now improve the model? I think on the first one, how do you actually extract it? I actually think this is a pretty under talked about phenomenon where there actually is, to your point, a lot of ways to get signal from production, both in terms of, to your point, like if someone responds and they're like, this sucks or whatever, like there's the usage data, but even inside the trajectory itself, right? Like if you have, for example, let's say you have some defined meta behavior where like you define that, on your own somewhere where it's like, hey, I would expect the agent when the user's, saying XYZ to like call the skills that they have. Maybe like a very basic one would be like, hey, if the user says use this skill, does it use this skill? Hopefully that'd be 100%, but like in theory, that could be some defined behavior. And then you can then actually run analyses against the trajectories, be like, hey, is that meta behavior being followed? And even though you don't have a ground truth for the output, you do have a ground truth of the expected behavior of the model at like some point in the trajectory, and you can diff against that expected behavior and see how it performed. And then if you combine that with ability to analyze reasoning traces and understand, is the model getting confused? How is it thinking about things, et cetera? You can, combine that together with all those different things to get to a pretty good sense of, hey, was this a good trajectory? Yeah. Regardless of how good or bad the output is.
Yeah, and so that's we've been deploying that kind of at scale.
That's really cool.
And one of the things that's interesting is that like what Claude, how essentially it's set up is that with the Claude ecosystem, they have a couple different ways that you can get all of the telemetry from a user's interaction with the model, whether they're in Claude Code or Claude Desktop or Claude AI.chat or Claude within Excel, through a combination of OTel, which is an open telemetry feed of every time a user types something in, presses enter, a model then decides to use a tool. It then decides to use a skill. A model has reasoning. It then sends back a result. That all flows into a central data store that you can configure Anthropic's environment to capture all of that. And then what we'll do is we'll then group every session together and then look for like a set of frustrations that the user had. What are the skills that were invoked? What are the tools that were used. Where are we going to classify this as research or risk? Are there any anything that is like specific to a given ticker? So like you kind of take this unstructured data, create some features within it, and then there might be some training or processing on top of that. So not say like, all right, what are all the features, or I'm sorry, what are all the frustrations that a user had in each one of these sessions, and try to identify what the root cause of it was. And so then if you can see an entire company's set of frustrations and then analysis of what the root cause is, you can then group by what are the most common ones and say like, hey, this is what we should be focusing on in order to mitigate the frustrations a company has with AI. And it suddenly becomes very actionable. And so being able to take that telemetry data, turn it into insights, and then figuring out what are the actions you can take on top of it becomes a feedback loop in which you making AI better and more effective, something that a COO or head of AI operations can start turning into an actual workflow that they can prioritize the 10 most important things at the start of their week, 3 most important ones at the start of the day. They're going to have the biggest impact on their user base, and start triaging them. And it's actually great for us. Like the Anthropic team has actually done all the heavy lifting by making all of that telemetry data accessible in one way. There's still some issues, and we talk on their product team a little bit on how they actually haven't organized what they have within Claude.ai that you get through the zip file. The open telemetry data has historically been a little bit different between Cowork and Claude Code, but they're doing their best to start centralizing the structures there. But to your point, being able to structure all of that data in a consistent data model and then analyzing it for different features that are important unlocks what I believe is like one of the most valuable data assets that exists today within the enterprise. And that is just the information that it acts as an exhaust of all the different way AI is used within a firm. And if an organization can capture all of that, harness it, and then start driving insights in many different ways, like that is what the future of continuous learning and being AI native and growing as an enterprise looks like. And that's regardless of whether you're a hedge fund or asset manager. That's true about, I think, any enterprise that's trying to figure out how they use AI as an organization.
Yeah. Like how could you get a good understanding of how your team is using AI, and how can you accurately prioritize how to make that adoption better?
100%.
Because essentially, it's not specific to our industry. It's specific to everyone.
And a lot of people are blind to it right now. Like they're rolling on AI and they have no idea how it's being used.
Yeah. Is that something that you also see with your clientele?
It's kind of interesting. It's almost like we see that more. We do a lot of the work about this with our Atlas team internally, right? Because we obviously deploy things like this. Given that we are not, Basis is its own platform. People work inside of Basis, right? People are not connecting with us through things. It's not as, I would not say it's as big of a thing at the moment, because all of the work to optimize sort of falls on us, at least at the moment. I think that as you start getting to more kind of memory and personalization and sort of understanding like what context is used when, right? To your point, being able to understand what is actually being used and how it's leveraged and when it's leveraged is actually really important. So, for example, like one of the things we do actually is we send out OSL traces and are starting to do more and more, especially with like big enterprise clients, specifically for that kind of for that sort of purpose. But I would not say it is a massive thing yet. I suspect it'll probably get bigger over the next year or so.
Everyone using your software through the Basis platform, everyone's logging into Basis. Mm-hmm. I feel like right now there's almost two kinds of camps within AI. There's one of bring people to where we are, and then the other one is let's ship things to where you are. Like, for example, I think skills and MCP connectors are good examples of, doesn't matter if you're operating within Claude or OpenAI or Perplexity, like here's a repository of open source skills, just download it and use it wherever you already are. How do you think about those two kind of camps, and how do you think about product as a whole as you're kind of navigating this industry that's constantly evolving?
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily in conflict. I think it just depends a little bit on your product strategy and kind of, I guess, the company strategy broadly. For us, Basis is not just a place that goes and does some work for you. It's a place to try to truly automate things end to end. And that's why people really like it. It's not really possible to do if you are going to like ChatGPT, right? Because there are certain things that you need from an auditability perspective, from a governance perspective, from an integration perspective, from a workflow UI perspective. Like there are things that if I were an accountant, I need to have in order to do my job and treat this as a place to do work that is not in a chatbot. And that's true both from the UI, and it's true from just like how stateful is it, right? Like what am I saving down and in what way? Like for example, there are lots of things you need to do that get saved down so that you have them in the future if you get audited, right? And you have these governance artifacts, and these are all these kind of things. And so we have taken the approach that if you want Basis to be able to actually automate stuff end to end, it requires not just the intelligence, it requires the understanding, the context, the workflows, the integration, et cetera, which is why it's within the Basis platform.
Mm-hmm. One question for you is, in order to have a process automated end to end, there has to be some boundaries of that process in the context of a business's entire operation, right? They still have an HR team that's going to have an HR process.
Sure.
They're still going to have a ERP system that manages, like, I don't know, their building software. And at an organization level, they ultimately then have to have these different workflows that are discrete enough in order to identify one platform that solves a process end to end, while not saying this solves my entire business in terms of the different workflows that I as a CEO have to be responsible for. And as frontier language models continue to push forward interfaces that allow me to integrate my disparate processes together, it does become very appealing to be able to still delegate out a given process to a platform that's an expert in that well-defined component of my business, but still come back to a single pane of glass, which might be co-work, or it might be a frontier models interface provider, or some other framework in which all of this workflow and information is integrated and consolidated together, while still being dependent on all the intelligence and capabilities within that platform, versus going to that platform and looking at that specific screen. And I'm curious how, like, just to Jhanvi's point, do you see that as a world that exists maybe 2, 3, 4 years from now, where there might be a single pane of glass that integrates best-in-class intelligence and workflows? Or do you still see a world where for that specific workflow, somebody is just logging into like the Basis platform and using Basis generated pixels for that interface for that tool? And if so, how do you think about where the boundaries are when building product?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think going to your first point on, let's say you have these other workflows and whatnot, I think an interesting question to think about is, in the future, what is the value of those things? Like, why is it just database? Is that the value, right? Because today, if I have some SaaS tool, the value is what? It is deterministic workflows. So the people at my company, know what process to follow. Mm-hmm. It is a database with certain rules around like what and who can read and write data. What else?
Mm-hmm. Well, like knowing how much to pay them on payroll every week, how to give them feedback, and I was going over like the HR system, like what their historical feedback has been from their manager.
So that's a database. Like you're saying, it stores data.
Well, the database exists, but just like something that captures that process. Yes, I'm not saying the database itself. I'm just saying that like there's a process to my business on how I manage people.
But if you're not going into that screen anymore, where is that process captured?
It's captured in my Claude Cowork, my specific skills associated, or it's run by an agent that's doing.
But then in that world, isn't the benefit of that software just a database now?
Yes, it very well still could be. The database can still be there.
No, but I guess the point I'm saying is like, I don't really understand in that world why you would have that other box. Like, if you're not going to that screen anymore and you're interacting with it in Cloud Cowork,
Yeah.
and all you're doing is reading and writing from a database, not other software.
Yeah.
Why? Like, why?
Yeah.
Like, it's lost the value.
Yeah, well, I would say it's encapsulating the logic of the workflow and the concepts in a very well-defined way
That I agree with.
that I want to continue to leverage in the expertise that whoever created that system embedded within the capabilities of it, encapsulate and abstract that general problem of HR management at an exceptional level or at a level well enough relative to how much I have to pay in order to get those capabilities. So the software, the database, I don't really care, but I care about the outcomes and the capabilities that it gives me. If it solves it with a person in a box with a pen and paper and they can write pen and paper fast enough and give me results, I'm not as interested necessarily in the technology, but the competency and the expertise that's embedded within that system is ultimately what I care about. The database doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this will be pretty. I have a lot of thoughts on this, that some of which I can't share publicly, but I think it is pretty idiosyncratic actually to the industry as to where those bounds are, depending on one's product strategy. And I think for a purchaser of software, I think it's useful to think a lot about where are you getting kind of intelligence proof benefits that you explicitly want to keep deterministic because it matters. And so the, existing logic that is built out there is is valuable and hard to replicate.
Oh, totally.
Right. And so I think in that case, like what are some classic examples, right? Like, rippling, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, I don't go into the rippling UI anymore, therefore I shouldn't have rippling. Like, no, of course they have all this logic that they built.
100%.
Right. So that's obvious.
Yeah.
But if it's something like, I don't know, Asana, right? In terms of, like the logic they've built out is what exactly? Not much, right? Like, if I'm Asana or something, or I'm linear, right? Like a lot of my value is the fact that I'm a great interface to go and do things for. And I'm a database behind that interface, and I have a lot of workflows for the users of the software. And if you just say, hey, no more users of the software anymore, well then maybe that doesn't make as much sense to go through. So I think you have to think about like, in that world in which you'd have less users of the software, where is the value in what is the value of the software? And I do think there are lots of things that have a ton of value.
Yeah.
I would actually argue that ERPs are a good example of that. Basis is very explicitly not an ERP for exactly this purpose.
Totally. Yeah.
Because there's huge amounts of value in the deterministic rule sets and validations that you've essentially built on top of the database that are really, really valuable and make sense to stay there. So I think it depends actually a little bit on the specific industry and business.
And I wasn't trying to say that those systems aren't valuable just because I'm not logging into them. Like they could still have just as much value, and I still might be accessing.
Well, I actually think some systems will not be valuable. I actually think this is what I mean. I think there'll be some systems that are like I'm saying they'll not be valuable.
Yes, but I think when you were jumping to, I
think some systems will be more valuable.
Yeah,
like I think some systems will be less valuable, some systems will be a lot more valuable, and I think where you fall on that line is somewhat idiosyncratic.
Yeah, but I think in the Asana example, if you're a new user and if you don't have a good process, like you do get process by going to Asana. And I think for organizations that have been using Asana, you could look at the Winston Churchill quote that says, if first you shape your tools and then your tools shape you. And so if you have been on Asana for a decade, I don't know if it's been around for a decade, and you've built your process around that, you have now internalized that into your organization. Such that the way that Asana is designed is very closely tied to how you organize and run your business. And so at that point...
But then you're not you're not, it depends. Are you trying to be an agent native company, or are you trying to like use Cowork, right? Like it's, that process you're talking about is incorrect for 2030.
Well, but like what if my agents interact with Asana? It's not like
now it's a new process. Like why do you care about the old process?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is the process might be the same. Like my Kanban board process, I'm not looking at the Kanban.
How could it be the same if suddenly you've gone from only humans doing stuff to now non-deterministic agents doing work at like huge amounts of parallelism, there's no way the process will be the same.
Sure, but like there's an in-between state where I want something that looks like my current process that I can delegate off to an agent. So like there's at least a stage where if an agent's going and making changes, it's representing those changes in the same Kanban board if I wanted to go and look at it as if my developers were using it. And the types of ways that we say like, oh, this is how we do sign off, or like, let's say you manage a SOC 2 compliance process in Asana, or you have some internal organization and business processes built into how that's reflected within Asana. It might be very natural to now say like, oh, I actually want my agents to go and update Asana in the same way that our people do. And if that's how you initially onboard into an agentic workflow, and your organizational like best practices and processes are now codified in agents that are like using Asana as a system of record, it might work very effectively for you. And I do think there's elements of being able to scale that system in a way that you can become AI native while still using Asana for a mechanism of organizing and process management. But then you might just stop logging into the Asana UI and you might start looking at a Cowork UI, but using still that Asana process management in an AI native company through that type of like slow evolution. I could see that. So at least I'm not saying I'm not a huge fan of Asana. I haven't used it a ton, but I could see a world where they actually could be quite successful, especially with an existing customer base. Saying that you're a new organization that wants to be AI native and like Asana is the unlock for that, I think I would question that. But for an organization on Asana right now that says I want to be AI native and I have a rationale for why I actually might double down on Asana, I think you could make a good argument for that.
Yeah, I think it is. I chose Asana like totally random.
Totally, yeah, I know. Right?
I that might be right. Like I don't think Asana specifically or anyone specifically is like on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. But I do think it'll be pretty polarizing. I think it's because the value, like if you move to a world in which you're not going to that UI, suddenly the value of the software went down dramatically specifically to that process piece you're talking about and the database piece. And so it just depends how much value is there in that piece. And I suspect that it differs dramatically by client and by software. Mm-hmm. And so, if you are of a software which you don't have a lot of business logic or it doesn't make sense anymore or whatever it is, that you don't care about it, then maybe it goes away, maybe it doesn't. Like, I think it's an interesting question. Like maybe a good analogy or interesting to think about is GitHub, right? Like GitHub is obviously in the news at the moment for lots of reasons, and people have lots of stuff built into GitHub, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so GitHub has been the beneficiary of that so far. Mm-hmm. But if you start to take stuff to its like logical extremes, right? You had the Graphites of the world and like the Devon Reviews of the world that built UIs on top of GitHub, right? Where now you're not going to, and so now once you're there, you're like, wait a second, like, what is the value of GitHub? Oh, right, it's the permissioning and it's like the storage and whatnot. It's like, okay. But then if you just recreate that and the switching costs are low, can you just switch? Maybe. And I think people starting to do that potentially right now. And it just sort of like just depends how much actually is there built out. And I imagine, if I am a company that has spent 20, to your point, like 20 years building out like specific processes in GitHub that are hard to port over and recreate, then maybe I would be less likely to switch versus if I'm just using GitHub because I'm using them as a database effectively, or an object store, then maybe it's a bit easier. I mean, mm-hmm. News already of some other companies that have done that. So
yeah,
I think it depends.
I mean, it does become harder to make a generic product that is a horizontal crossed industry without a lot of domain specific taste to justify.
You mean like an AI just generally?
Well, I just mean like a horizontal version control system.
Oh,
or
sure.
A horizontal project management system that is just something that is horizontal, non-domain specific. It has taste in the horizontal, but the taste is so generalized. It's difficult to make a product like that and justify a high enough spend from the user's perspective.
Yes, I totally agree.
In a world of AI, because the AI is the long...
Of course.
Yeah,
of course. So, yeah. I mean, like Linear is a great example, right? Like Linear is an amazing software. Like we use Linear. And linear is amazing because it was a far better experience to use it than Jira or Asana. I guess if we're getting on a project management track, it would be pretty much impossible, I think, to build a linear today or in the near future, because the differentiation linear had was that it was better for a human to use. And that is not a possible differentiation. Now, I think a possible differentiation is it's more ergonomic for agents to use, and thinking deeply about that. But the whole like, oh, it's a better UI for or UX for humans, like that's gone already.
Yeah.
I think, to your point on like the horizontal piece.
And like linear's pretty good for AI, but it's not that incredible. Like it doesn't have like natural embedding search that you don't have to build outside of the box. Like I don't even know if there's an LLM.text or there is the MCP server that we connect to, which is actually pretty nice. I don't think there's a linear CLI. I'm probably going to get a bunch of people in my DMs like, what are you talking about? Have you seen all the new features that linear has?
Linear's pretty good.
But again, we don't log on to the UI anymore. We just go to Claude and be like, hey, what's going on?
I don't log into the UI as much as I used to. It does seem like there's a tendency of like pushing too much AI into linear that like I can tell when somebody wrote a ticket themselves via hand, it's very articulate. And some of our people on our team, no names, I know that it was written by AI.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for Jhanvi, she's been using M-dashes since before AI. And so while I think that everything she writes is AI written, she will clarify.
I am like adamantly using, I'm honestly using M-dashes more as a retaliation of
I think it's a good approach.
this notion that like if you have M dashes in your content, I think the content, the words around the M dashes matter more to me. But I love M dashes. They're my favorite form of punctuation, and now they've just been
They gotta go.
ruined.
They
And
can't.
he was like, you can't use M dashes. I was like, I wrote that manually. I wrote that part
She
manually.
usually send a client email and it had like 7 or 8 different M dashes. So I was like, you gotta write it. Yeah, you can't do it.
I was like, I wrote that shit manually.
You know, it's funny. We have, I mean, one thing we do inside the company is we have a concept called DYSB. Really should be DYSBT, which is do you stand by this? And the key is we always remind everybody that like AI generated outputs are for yourself, not for others.
Yeah.
And so anytime you do something, like if you're going to give someone AI generated output, you have to calibrate your amount of confidence. And so it's kind of funny. It's like people give people outputs like, hey, here's a PR. I do not stand by this, you know, or like, hey, here's a change. And that has actually helped. We made that change about 3 months ago. That has helped a lot because we're obviously a very, you know, AI native company. We have an entire team whose job it is to build agents internally. And I think building good cultural practices around interacting with agents and how that relates to like trust with your own coworkers, I think has been actually really important because we had the exact same issue.
Yeah.
Here and there.
We had somebody join on Monday, and when we were talking about what they were doing on their first, second day, they kept saying the AI is doing this or like the AI is doing that. And I had to correct him, and I'm not sure exactly where I stand, but like, you can't just say the AI is doing something, you're doing it.
Yeah.
And the AI is doing it on your behalf. And so like, don't get in the habit of abdicating responsibility to the AI when it's ultimately doing something based off of your instructions. So I'm not sure what the right pronoun is. Like, should that person be saying, I'm doing this, we are doing this, using a third party pronoun like he, she, they? They're not trying to make any sort of statement out of it. It's more of like how you think about the sense of ownership when AI is part of the work product, and what language you should use to be able to not abdicate ownership to this AI that like the AI doesn't care. Or maybe it does care, maybe it doesn't, but like I need you to care in the right way that you talk about it so that reflects the ownership that ultimately you have. You're still responsible for it.
Yeah, I think I don't know the answer, but I always like to pattern match against human organizations. And it's like, if you have a team leader and you're like, hey, like, where's that at? And they're like, oh, Bob is on it or something. There's a way of wording that does not abdicate responsibility, but it probably just comes down to not the words, but like the trust in the person and understanding. It's like, oh, obviously you're the leader of that team. Like, I'm holding you accountable, not Bob. Right.
Yeah.
But it is factual that, hey, Bob is currently working on it. But the implication is that you will ensure it is good or whatever is the nature of the thing before you give it to me to review. You know, I'd probably change a little bit on the context, but it's easier with obviously when you're, you know, it's like the human patterns are more clear.
Especially in a client-facing business, I feel like instilling that sentiment within the organization is very important, where I think that a lot of times it's just too easy to see the output that AI generates, especially if it's a little bit lengthy, and just be like, yes, skimming this looks good, send it out. And this idea, this cultural pillar that you are the person that is building or writing or creating whatever you're sending out to the world, regardless of how much of it was AI generated, I think is very important. Like having that level of accountability, because otherwise it's just pure chaos, you know?
One thing that you helped instill in the company is using the term we. So it's a collective ownership. And I love that. I try to do it as much as I can.
We need to do that on our old team.
Yeah. But what if it's just you and AI? So it's like me and my agents. And if you were to say, what's the status of X? Should you also use the first person plural we? Like we're working on it.
I think you should say I.
I'm working on it.
But to your point, right? Like if there is something that's running on my cowork and I'm waiting for a result and someone asks, hey, what's the status of this? I'd be like, oh, it's running in cowork. I should have a result soon. I'll review it. I'll send a version out to you at some point.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. I think the key is just building a culture that not just celebrates owning your output and actually standing by your output, but importantly, I think calls out aggressively that, taking some large output that you don't fully stand by and then sending it to somebody is actually rude. It is a rude thing to do, right? Like, and I think that a lot of people don't fully appreciate that at first. It's like the classic quote. I forget from exactly who it was, where it was like, sorry, I sent you such a long letter. Yeah, such a long letter. Like I didn't have time to write a shorter one, right? And it is very easy to write a lot of words, very easy to get a lot of output. It's actually very hard to do that, succinctly. And I think that's true on everything from a Slack message to a prompt change to, a code change to whatever. And so people, but I think it is okay to send AI outputs because people just want to be helpful, right? Like if someone, sends this question, like, I don't know, whatever, and I throw it into a deep research and I get output, that is valuable output. But if I'm sending that to them, it needs to be very clear. We need to calibrate my confidence on that. Is it like, hey, this is like deep research output, you're welcome, I ran a deep research on your behalf? Or is it, I ran this, I thought about it, like, I actually believe this. Take a look. Yeah. Those are just such different ways of working.
I think the magnitude with how much scrutiny I review the output is a function of the audience, right? Like if I'm writing a quick note to 4 people on my team, I'm writing in all lowercase, I'm writing shorthand. Same thing applies with AI. Like whatever AI output, I'm going to review it to make sure that it's accurate, but I'm not going to remove my M dashes if it's if it's an internal memo, And so that's how you can move quickly while still kind of maintaining a certain level of polish in your work.
Or you can have a like Jhanvi skill.
I do. I have.
And it just has lots of more M dashes.
I say always use M dashes whenever possible. I'm also a big semicolon person. So a lot of my AI generated content has semicolons, which is kind of rare for most people. But yeah, I have a tone skill and I actually have. So what I do is every time I use AI to write something, I obviously edit pieces of it. And so when I have to make major modifications, I'll basically open up a markdown file. I'll paste what AI gave me and then the version that I eventually sent out. And I put that in a folder in my desktop called like tone improvement.
Nice.
And then every month I have this cowork schedule task that goes through all of those markdown files and recommends modifications to the tone skill to make it better. And then it'll basically send me a Slack message and say, hey, like, here are some improvements that you can make on your tone skill. Click on the session and download that skill and kind of refresh your sessions and kind of start over again, which is kind of helpful. It is getting to a place, it's been a couple months and it is getting to a place where it's starting to overfit, where like the suggestions that it gives me are just not good. It's very clearly overfitting to like the couple of suggestions or the couple of examples that I have in that folder. But that's kind of how I got to a place where I don't edit what AI sends me nearly as often as I used to 3 months ago. It's like pretty solid. It's cool.
My tone skill classifies for the audience. Also, I think you're saying you talk about this. And so if it's a sales versus it's internal versus Slack versus it's email, it changes it a little bit. Internal, very curate, very straightforward.
Yeah. I actually got kind of offended one time. I was like, I want to write the Slack message to the team. This is what I want to write. And it gave me an output that was like all lowercase, like U was just the letter U.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, why did you write it this way? And it was like, based on your Slack messages, this is how you write internally. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. Let's not do that again.
Yeah. It's also like, I think I talked about it in a previous podcast where I spent a session analyzing all of my interviews. And so tell me about what I do well as an interviewer, what I could actually do better, and what I'm leaving on the table. And so opposed to feeding in all of my transcripts from the interviews of analyzing candidates, it was actually really helpful to have it analyze me. And actually, I got a lot out of it. So there's like all these different internal introspection things that you can do with AI when you analyze your tone, your voice, your email. It can be somewhat objective, and it's in a safe space where if you want it to be a nice guy or a mean enemy, like you can kind of choose your own adventure. But it's a good way to like learn a lot about yourself. So yeah, with that. What else do we want to go on the pod? There's a couple things I wanted to touch on, semi-related. Do you use OpenClaw at all?
I've never actually used OpenClaw. I've used Hermes before. I don't really currently use it as a, like, in work as like a production thing, but I do have a Mac Mini on my desk that is currently in a package that I've, like, I just honestly don't have enough time to like try to set it up. But the problem is I would need to decide from a security perspective, the right ways to do it. It'd probably be like, only writes to my Slack or something like that. But I haven't had enough time, honestly, to like get it really, really good. Like I run all my stuff personally, locally.
Mm-hmm.
And that works quite well. So.
Is there any like new development in AI that is particularly exciting or interesting to you?
You mean from from the models or like the products, or just from a research perspective?
Anything. Like what are you geeking out over right now?
I mean, it's kind of funny. This is not a new development, but I think going deep on how to actually write for LLMs, I think is a really interesting question. Like there's so much you can do from an optimization perspective in terms of the context you treat it, because not enough people think about, right? If you have a agent that is operating, let's say on your code base, right? The code base is now training data. It literally is training data. You're training the model at runtime because models learn at inference time. And so how you should write for the agents and how you want to structure your context is actually really, really important, because you're essentially curating training data. And that's true, obviously, for like agents we have in production, but that's also true for internal agents. And I think thinking deeply about what is the right amount of progressive disclosure, like how to think about sentence structures. Do you use the imperative? Do you not? How like curt can you be? How, like, what are the right principles for how you actually write English there? I think are all really, really interesting questions. And how do you think about where you're more prescriptive versus where you're less prescriptive? Where do you give examples versus where you don't give examples? How do you think about like having principles versus not? How do you test and eval this? Like we actually run evals now on coding agents in our code base, which is pretty cool. Which we started doing that 2 weeks ago, and we have some fun results from that. Yeah, I think so. Like one of the things I just spent like 10 hours about a month ago on a Saturday making, because I could not find a good example of this online, is writing a really, really good skill on how to write context, which is like one of the most important skills of the company, because it is used all the time, as you can imagine, both for our production context, and which is like our context that's used in production agents, as well as context that is used internally for like my own skills or people's like organization skills, whatever. And that is, I think, really hard. And there's just honestly not a lot of good writing out there about how to do that at an abstract level, both at a system prompt level, at a like progressive disclosure, i.e. skill level, at a, user prompt, like an agent.md level, et cetera.
Yeah. I think that might be that was the first organizational skill that we put into our plugin marketplace, the AI
Yeah,
designs.
there was probably around 200 different comments on it.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
It was because it's a problem that people are still solving in real time, which is one of the more interesting problems that exist, right?
Yeah, it is not. I searched. I was like, I really thought that I would just grab a skill from that somebody else has published online. I could not find a good one. Most of them were just total slop.
There is the Anthropic skill creator skill that comes out of the box, but there's so much stuff that it's leaving on the table. And there's also taste as well. Like if you want to have assets, but one, do you want to have assets? Where should you define assets? What are the different, like in terms of how do you want to think about progressive disclosure? What are the ways that you want to do cross-skill linking? There's many ways in which you could do that. There's reusage of terminology. So like if you want to, like how do you think about introducing new concepts outside of the skill MD that are in some of the sub resources? And how do you have this like lexical taxonomy such that the primary skill introduces all of the high level concepts, and all of the concepts that are introduced after that in some of the sub resources all logically fit together with that higher level concept such that it makes sense when new things are introduced outside of from the front matter to the actual skill to a sub resource. So that when the language model does go through a progressive disclosure and bring new context into the active window, that it was likely what the language model intended to do when it says, oh, I actually need to pull in this other resource. Yes, logically, that is the information that I generally expected to be here versus pulling in new context that now is not relevant to what the model actually wanted. And you're unintentionally polluting the context window with all these tokens that are completely irrelevant.
Yeah, I think the skill creator skills do a good job of thinking about like skill structure and obviously teaching like how progressive disclosure and a lot of that stuff. And I think you're totally right that there's a lot that can be even improved there. I think the thing that is tricky is that what makes a good skill is actually totally different based on the harness and based on your use case, right? Like if you think about our agents in production, let's say we have the concept of skills, right? Every time the agent runs, the skills or whatever you want to call them, the docs of progressive disclosure is the same every time, right? Unless we've chosen to change it. There's nothing just randomly changing, right? Whereas that's not true inside of, your code base per se for like you. Like if I run an agent, someone else could have just like changed the skill. And it's not like, there is it's not like you're running crazy evals every single time anyone changes any skill in your code base because the blast radius is relatively low. But things are changing all the time. The environment's changing all the time. And by definition, the code is changing all the time. And so, I always think of it like how it's like the environment itself is not static. And so the right patterns of how to write skill descriptions, which by the way, terrible term, it should be called trigger, skill descriptions and the level of progressive disclosure and all that changes a lot based on our stuff changing all the time. Yeah. How often the skill's changing? Do you have 5 skills? Do you have 1,000 skills? What level? And obviously skills, one of my big pet peeves is that skills don't let you go more layers down as a concept. I mean, you can actually do it. It's just technically it's against the standard, but it kind of doesn't matter. How many layers down do you want to go? And that changes a lot based on your data corpus. And so there's that level where like how you make the right skill changes a bit depending on the situation. And then 2, the things that the skill creator skills don't get into is stuff like sentence structure and how do you actually write? What information do you want to put in the middle versus at the end? How do you actually write the lowest amount of tokens for the highest amount of information is a very, very difficult thing. And it's very different than human writing. And that's where I think a lot of LLMs, when they try to write skills or things, because they're trained on human text, they write like humans. And human writing isn't good for LLMs because when I write for other humans, you care about things like evoking emotion. You care about things like convincing the reader to finish reading the page. With an LLM, you don't care about that. The LLM is going to read the whole page. You don't need to convince it, in the paragraph with like language that's like, ooh, this is exciting. Like, it doesn't matter. All you're doing is providing instructions in a way that is unambiguous, that can reduce, the confusion about what I actually should do. And so there's so much about human writing that is completely irrelevant when you write for LLMs. And LLMs, by definition, are not good at that because they're trained on human writing. And humans are also not good at that. And so I think that's the challenge that I just could not find good stuff online. So that's why I spent a lot of time building that out. But now it's great because now it gets used all the time for things. But yeah, it's all very interesting.
And figuring out that information density of a skill is not easy because you're making the Descartes quote where like, I'm sorry I couldn't write this in 2 pages, so I wrote it in 10. It takes time to get it into the most information dense and concise way possible to articulate a given workflow or concept that is inherently not easy. It's interesting to see like the role of people that study language and linguists and people that study English or even philosophy, where there is a logical system in which they have to structure outside of numbers that encapsulate language and ideas, which I think is getting more valuable. We've interviewed some people that had philosophy majors that were comp sci post-graduate or post education, and they're actually like very interesting candidates for some of these like agentic skill-driven workflows where them having a pedagogical background in general logic and philosophy and language, but having a bit of a comp sci experience as a professional after the last 5 years is actually like a very unique skill set that we're actually like, I'm kind of seeking out philosophy majors that also are like really strong with programming as a really good candidate base for being able to write some of these skills and thinking through these concepts, because this is foreign to most people that have a traditional CS background. Like this is not something that most people in CS have a background in, like different types of communication styles. I think there's something else. There's honestly so many things you just touched on that I wanted to go in.
Well, just to comment just on one thing you mentioned there, because I think it's really, and then we can talk about the other stuff, is the way, so I've also thought about this a lot. And funny enough, actually, we currently are hiring roles. We call them language/intelligence architects, and we're also hiring agent managers. And these sort of map onto that a little bit. But what I kind of think about is that there's slightly two different things there. There is the systems thinking needed to engineer things well. And I think people don't appreciate that engineering is not actually about code, right? Like mechanical engineering, there's lots of engineering. I would also argue things like, the founding fathers are actually engineers.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? Like you are engineering, you're building a system and you're making decisions about how, specific the system is going to be here, how open I want the system to be here, where I want it to be open for interpretation versus where I want it to be deterministic, et cetera, et cetera. And when you write laws, you are engineering. And so I actually think the systems thinking is the key. And a lot of, I'll call them coders. A lot of coders are not good at systems thinking, especially more junior ones. But a lot of engineers really are good at systems thinking. And so the ones who are good system thinkers, I think, do map onto it. But I think a lot of, as you said, like the CS folks, the average engineer is not a good systems thinker by definition, because it's very hard. And so when you find people who are great systems thinkers and then they're also good at language, that is, I think, the sweet spot. But I do think that there's slightly two different things where you could find someone who's a great systems thinker, like, hey, here's how I want the agent to behave, and they're like totally correct. And then there's like, how can I take those desires and properly articulate them to the agent? And I think there is place for writers, people who are amazing at language, people who are like really thoughtful on how to articulate concepts in a way that works well, but don't have the systems thinking capability to like actually understand the system end to end and make good decisions about like exactly how this trigger should behave compared to this trigger, compared to where the disclosure should be here, because that's actually not a language problem. It's an engineering problem. It's a systems problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to think of those two things as like completely separate. And if you're a big enough scale, everything can be specialized. I think we're small enough where we can think about those kind of like one and the same.
Totally. I'm not saying we definitely don't have people who are specialized in those. I'm just
that'd be incredible.
Skill sets are different.
Totally.
Yeah.
The other thing that you touched on was the way in which you were describing skills, in the sense that they are a structured format that you have to follow. And I've started to appreciate that that's just not the case.
Yeah, I agree.
Like keeping skills in like the open spec definition of skills is unnecessary. Ultimately, they just get converted into tokens, and using skills as the way they've been defined for a structure helps with distribution with other systems. But there's no need for it to be structured in the way that...
Well, I think there's a little need in that the models are now being trained on skills in that way, right? So like, you could, for example, just have, and we used to do this before the skill standard came out, because skills, it's fucking folders and markdown files, apologize my language. And so we used to just actually have it in a different format. The reason we would convert stuff to skills is because the models now get trained to look for the description, and they look for the skill.md, and they're trained to think about just the naming of those things. Now it might end up being marginal, honestly, so where it doesn't really matter. But so I think some things matter more than others. Like the naming in the front matter of the thing being called description with the information there probably matters a lot more than whether your template you put in the assets folder or in the references folder. Like that probably doesn't matter that much. But things that are like higher blast radius, like the description, probably matter a little bit more, where like why fight against the training. So I agree with you. I agree that it probably doesn't matter, but the training is the only thing.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting is how OpenClaw implements skills if you use the Claude Code SDK is different than if you use Claude Code directly and use skills. I spent kind of like some time over the last weekend going into how OpenClaw integrates with all of these different CLI tools. And ultimately what it is that there's the OpenClaw interface that you have when you go to the website, when you host it. And then there's a gateway that is running as a separate process that will wrap the actual command CLI call to Claude or to Codex or to Pi or to OpenCode as though it's running it within a bash or a separate process, and shell out to it, and then just stream the results back over a WebSocket. And then that WebSocket can get rerouted to Slack or to WhatsApp, Telegram, or to the web UI, which is where you can see the chat. But just this process wrapped with the WebSocket. And then I was like, oh, so if it's just a different interface depending on Codex, OpenCode, Pi, Claude Code, how does it implement skills? Because like skills are actually like mounted onto the Claude Code process, but in OpenClaw you define skills outside of where Claude Code expects it to run. And I was like, oh, well, so there has to be something that it's doing there. And so how OpenClaw mounts skills into the harness for Claude Code is it actually blocks Claude Code from using any of its native skill capabilities, as you can't use those. You can define that when you run the Claude Code CLI. But what I am going to do is I'm going to string concatenate all of the front matters of all of the skills that exist within OpenClaw, and then append that onto the system prompt when I call out to Claude Code. And so while it still does exist within the Claude Code like runtime context, they are hacking the actual system context that Claude Code normally gets when it goes to call skills. And then they actually have another tool that they use in order to actually go and start reading in files for skills. And they actually don't use the skill call. They just use a read function. Because ultimately all it is doing a read function of an underlying file. And so I actually found that, and then they do similar things when they do the Codex wrapper and reimplementation. Same thing when they do the Pi wrapper and implementation. And so it started like getting me to appreciate that you can take these skills and then make them available to language models in many different ways beyond just like the default distribution mechanism in which skills are used with a lot of the current agentic harnesses right now. And I think there's room for a lot more creativity that exists than what we have right now. And for example, I was talking to Lucian on our team, and we were saying, well, we have all of these skills. What if we were to mount them all onto the agent SDK? So the agent SDK now has all the skills. And now we want to put an MCP server in front of that agent SDK and create one tool, which is master skill. And so opposed to then having my Claude Code desktop session have all of these skills mounted onto it and Claude can determine which skills to pull in, I can instead go to a agent, which will then get context of the conversation and be able to determine, well, what are all of the skills that I ultimately could combine together and contextualize optimally for the actual use case. So let's not do like the explicit tokens as they were defined generically before. Let me take those and then optimize them specifically for the actual problem at hand. So it's not generalized, it's specific. And so doing some element of inference prior to the skill injection. And it actually worked very interestingly. Now, you have to change the way, like it had some downsides, but like having one level of intelligence prior to injecting those skills into context of the parent process is actually pretty powerful. Another thing that we're exploring is that because we have the entire conversation history stored in a central repository with an MCP server on top of it, we can then have that agent process that is doing the curation of like this, like the best combination of skills for the current workflow, be able to go and look at what that current workflow is doing. So don't just tell me what context you've sent me over the MCP server. Let me go and review everything that you're currently doing. So I have almost this God view of what you're actually doing right now, maybe what you've done in the past, and who you are as a person, like do some additional inference. And then now let me create an even better set of skills based off of the predetermined set of skills that I have, and then send that back. So it's the best possible combination of tokens that your parent LLM or your parent API or your parent session could possibly have, that is some level of curation prior to injecting those predetermined set of skills. And so I think we're still very early on the journey of like, what is the best way that we can inject expert context into a workflow? And there's just so much opportunity for creativity in that. And I think what OpenClaw did around that, I think is kind of interesting. I think then putting another layer on top of it, you could do even more. And I think, like I said, I just think we're very early stages of that.
Yeah, man, I think you're getting at, I mean, I'm generally a big proponent of, if you look at some of the stuff I talk about on Twitter, like a big proponent of the concept of RLMs and recursive language models. And, you know, I think you're effectively starting to get at what RLMs are. Like RLMs are just the logical conclusion of some of the stuff you're talking about, which is that you give the model the ability to completely engineer its own context entirely. Right, it's essentially using it. You're leveraging its intelligence to decide what should be in the context window at every forward pass of, you know, your like model sampling, which is sort of what you're referring to in terms of like having the model. You're saying, well, like out of all the skill descriptions, like let me decide which one should be inside of the prompt. But you can even take that a step further. Be like, why not do that for the entire context? Why just the skills? Right? And that's the whole idea of like doing things recursively, is you essentially are betting on the models to go and do that, you know, consistently at every pass. Which there are a lot of pros and cons of that. But I do generally think that if you really think about, one of our principles internally is called better intelligence. If you really think about the better intelligence approach, and you think about how you can leverage intelligence in the lack of, you know, when you have a lack of continual learning in models over a period of time, how can you leverage just unbelievable amounts of intelligence to let a model regulate its own state for a longer period of time, regulating its own context window with complete power is essentially the logical conclusion of that. And so I think I actually totally agree with that. And I think that is the exact method. You know, I think there's some tactical questions to discuss, but like I think the general trajectory to me is like pretty clear. And you start to see that already, right? Where, you know, in the way you think about subagents, right? Like, why do subagents start to work now and they didn't work 8 months ago? Because the models are not smart enough to orchestrate subagents, right? Orchestrating subagents requires decent theory of mind onto another agent and thinking about like what context it sees and what could be useful for me to define. You're now defining not just a task, you're defining an output and a goal. And like, I have an output contract that I'm asking for the subagent to give me. And so you need to be really smart to like know, okay, for this task, how do I decide which subagents to give it while not having a subagent do work that if I did not do as the main agent it's okay for me not to do. Because there's lots of work, if I didn't do as the main agent, I would end up doing a bad job at my total task, right? Which is why you can't paralyze everything. And so I think there's a lot of really, really interesting things to think about there.
And like we are very close to it. Like most agentic harnesses allow the agent to do its own context curation by determining what's the next tool to call out to, and then just add that to the context.
But it can't remove context.
Well, that's the interesting thing. That's what you're touching on, right? Like you're saying, like allow the LLM to determine the harness, or at least build a harness that it's more flexible than just append. Allow the model to be able to determine what does it actually need for the next turn completely autonomously.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good. I mean, I highly recommend folks go read about it. I think Alex Zhang and Omar Khattab, I think their lab has done a lot of really, really great work on showing that you take even pretty small models, and if you run them in an RLM harness, they can just perform unbelievably well because you're essentially throwing just a massive amount of computed inference time, and that compute is leveraged really well. Because if you think about a trajectory, right, if the model is on like model sampling 10, there's a bunch of tool outputs like earlier that are just completely unrelated to this task.
Totally.
And so why is the model needing to look at those and keep attention over those as it's going through it? The reason right now is because of the benefits of keeping the same KV cache in terms of the way you interact with the model providers. And so that's actually the answer, is why you don't have like these like massive, or that's one of the answers as to why you don't go like fully RLM build. But I think if you put aside, cache optimization and cost, I think the benefits of, especially as the model's getting really, really smart, of letting the model truly decide what is inside its own context, not just at compaction, not just at subagent calling, but literally every single time, is I think is very much in my mind the future. So
cool. And with that, I think that's a wrap. Mitch, thanks for coming on the episode.
Thanks for having me, guys.
100%. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. So again, this is the Hedgineer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Watson.
I'm Jhanvi Virani.
And we will catch you next time. Follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, you name it, we're probably there. Take it easy, everyone.
The Hedgineer Podcast releases episodes weekly on Tuesday. Our hosts are Michael Watson and Jhanvi Virani. The Hedgineer Podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Free. Follow us on your social platform of choice and reach out to us at podcast@hedgineer.io.